The girl's name is Rael. When she was young, she had an extremely happy family, but in order to protect his company, her father was beaten to death by a K-Ball family right in front of his wife and children. Rael wanted to avenge her father, but the K-Ball family not only had wealth, they also had the backing of a political boss. A lawyer named Pyong wanted to help her, but he simply didn't have enough power to shake the status of the Chaebol family. On the contrary, he lost his job because of it. After the lawsuit failed, the lawyer could only take Rael overseas. On the day they said goodbye at the airport, to keep Rael from being hunted down, so Pyong gave her a new identity. Looking at her enemies on the airport screen, Rael recalled the sinister and mocking smile of her enemy on the day her father died in the hospital. She made a vow to herself that she would return to find them and avenge her father. Since that day, Rael seemed to vanish from the world, and even her mother didn't know where she was. 13 years passed quickly, and the lawyer from back then had become a member of parliament. That day, he received a package from the US. After opening it, he found a pile of cash and a note inside. After reading it, Pyong realized that the girl from back then had returned and was preparing her plan for revenge to reclaim everything she had lost. At that moment, Rael was stuck at the gate of the kindergarten. Today was her daughter's first day at school. The other parents were complaining because a big political figure was visiting the school. In contrast, they were treated unfairly. Rael stepped out of the car to check, only to unexpectedly see the enemy who had haunted her dreams for the past 13 years inside the school. That terrifying smile was like a sharp knife that making Rael impossible to breathe. Just then, the pain in her palm jolted her awake. She then saw the son-in-law of the Chaebol family among the crowd, and at the moment their eyes met, she knew her chance for revenge had come. For someone with a low status like Rael to approach such a powerful Chaebol family, then the shortest way was to capture his heart. The old man before her was none other than the Prime Minister of South Korea. He had used the most ruthless means to obtain his position. 13 years ago, for the benefit of his company, he had beaten Rael's father to death. So 15-year-old Rael was determined to avenge her father. After 13 years of silently suffering, Rael had changed her identity and re-entered the present world of this man once again. At the kindergarten's opening ceremony, Rael danced in a sparkling yellow dress, and the man mesmerized by her performance from the audience was none other than the son-in-law of her enemy. His name was Guillaume. In his daze, he felt as though Rael's eyes were staring directly at him. As the dance reached its climax, the fire inside Guillaume was ready to burst. Hearing the women behind him praise Rael's seductive figure, and glancing at the wife sitting beside him, whom he had long grown tired of, he felt his entire body heat up. Shortly after the performance ended, Rael stepped out of the hall under the glittering night sky. As she walked past Guillaume, she intentionally gave him a flirtatious glance and even dropped her bracelet. In his marriage, Guillaume and his wife were only together in name, so how could he resist the allure of a woman as beautiful as Rael? So he picked up the bracelet and hurried after her. But when he reached a dressing room and opened the door, he witnessed Rael in an intimate scene with her boyfriend, unaware that this was the first step in her revenge plan. After having done it with the man, Rael left the dressing room and casually made her way to the cocktail party to deliberately greeting Guillaume. Her indifferent expression was as if nothing had happened. As Guillaume picked his glass up, Rael intentionally brushed her hand against his, causing his heart to stir once again. Earlier that morning, on the parent-teacher meeting, Rael had purposely placed Guillaume's daughter's backpack beneath the feet of a woman named Dam Ri, a woman whom Sora openly disdained. So she was extremely dissatisfied with Sora, who also happened to be Guillaume's wife. When Dam Ri opened the bag and found baby diapers inside, she checked the name and realized they belonged to Sora's daughter. Immediately, Dam Ri began mocking Sora, saying that Sora didn't know how to take care of her child. This remark was a direct slap in Sora's face. As the wife of the richest man in South Korea, how could she tolerate such ridicule? Unexpectedly, it was Sora's daughter who became angry first. The little girl scratched the face of a boy who had been laughing at her, leaving him injured. Hearing the commotion, Sora's bodyguards outside the door rushed in immediately. But as a noblewoman herself, Dam Ri wasn't one to back down and started a confrontation with Sora. Meanwhile, Rael, that standing on the side, was secretly smiling as everything was going according to her plan. The situation then escalated, as Rael had anticipated, with the two noblewomen refusing to yield to each other. Sora demanded that Dam Ri's son be expelled from the kindergarten, while Dam Ri insisted that Sora apologize. This left the principal with a serious headache, as she couldn't afford to offend either side. Rael then stepped in as the mediator, suggesting a way to resolve the conflict between the two parents, which was to have a conversation with Sora's husband. Soon after Guillaume arrived at the kindergarten, the moment he saw Rael, he was immediately reminded of the scene he had accidentally witnessed during the opening ceremony, that Rael and her boyfriend making love. Distracted by those thoughts, he mindlessly agreed to the request to apologize to the other parent. Afterward, Rael and Guillaume began discussing their children's education. The man who had never personally picked up his child from school suddenly came that evening, but only to return the bracelet Rael had intentionally dropped at the party. Rael pretended to be overjoyed and said that the bracelet was a keepsake from her father. After thanking him, she eagerly tried to put it back on, but fumbled on purpose. Seeing the bracelet slip again and again, Guillaume stepped in to help her. In the moment his hand touched her skin, Guillaume seemed to feel his entire body heating up as the image of holding a glass of wine with her flashed through his mind once again. Meanwhile, Rael kept a calm expression on purpose because she knew that this man had completely taken the bait. The man with a faintly visible six-pack was now bowing his head to listen to the scolding of the chaebol's wife, just because his earlier behavior had displeased her. Furious, she smashed her glass of wine and began to insult him viciously. Over the years, lacking her husband's love had made her temperament extremely irritable, so the bodyguard was well aware of the consequences of offending the mistress, so he just could only silently endure the abuse. Before leaving, she even warned him not to mention what had happened between the two of them. When Guillaume got home, Sora noticed he had picked up their child and immediately asked why he had done so today, as it was usually the secretary's job. But Guillaume criticized her, saying that when their daughter needed her, then she was never at home. Sora, after hearing that, feeling guilty, so she quickly took her daughter to her room and soothed her to sleep. That same day, Guillaume went again to pick up their daughter. After the bodyguard helped the little girl into the car, Guillaume stayed behind to discuss the truth of life with the teacher. As they sat down, Guillaume happened to notice an organ on the table. At this time, he was quite surprised, as this instrument was very rare in Korea, and those who could play it were even rarer. Guillaume had always loved its sound. Unexpectedly, Rael mentioned that she knew how to play it. It was obvious she had deliberately learned it for him. As the music slowly filled the room, Guillaume closed his eyes and swayed to the melody. When he opened them again, he saw Rael standing in front of him and invite him to dance. She told him that the song was called The Forgotten Memory, and it was about a beggar who once wore the robes of an emperor. During that time, he suffered a head injury and lost his memory, so when he woke up, he spent the rest of his life believing he was the emperor. This song advises men to forget themselves and rediscover their own desires. Tango is a dance where the rhythm syncs with the heartbeat, heart meets heart, that merging into one. Under Rael's guidance, Guillaume became increasingly immersed in it, forgetting his identity as one of the wealthiest tycoons in South Korea. Instead, he only thought of himself as a young artist experiencing the beginnings of love. After the dance, when Guillaume returned home, he felt deeply troubled and restless. Though his wife lay in his arms, his thoughts were consumed with Rael. Meanwhile, Rael entered a mysterious room filled with surveillance equipment and a wall covered in photographs. All of this was meticulously prepared for her revenge plan. Rael took down Guillaume's picture, clearly showing that this man was already in the palm of her hand. The next day, Sora confided in her bodyguard that she had finally made love with her husband. The tycoon's wife that be neglected by her husband for 10 years. Now that she had regained her husband's affection, then all the bodyguards who had worked tirelessly for her before were discarded like trash. Not only that, because she wasn't satisfied with her performance in bed with her husband, she went to a cosmetic surgery clinic. She not only had facial treatments, but also instructed her secretary to arrange an appointment at a gynecological clinic. The secretary heard and thought she wanted to go to the gynecologist, so she ended up getting scolded by the lady. What Sora meant was that she wanted to have cosmetic surgery on her vaginal. The staff quickly apologized and hurried to make the arrangements. After everything was prepared and she returned home, the nearly 50-year-old Sora suddenly changed into a sexy nightgown and told the nanny to prepare some stimulating toys in the bedroom, as she intended to completely win over her husband's heart tonight. Sora quietly entered Guillaume's reading room, then played romantic music and invited him to shower and go to bed. But the look of fear in his eyes was enough to show that he had no desire for it, because the last time they were intimate, Guillaume had only been able to be with his wife by imagining she was someone else. Afterwards, Guillaume sat motionless with a glass of wine in his hand, while the woman dancing on the screen was the one who had stirred his heart. After a mental struggle, Guillaume decided to call Rael and invite her to the family's villa for a party. At this moment, Rael was overjoyed because she was eagerly anticipating catching this prime target. Meanwhile, the husband, that unaware of what was about to happen, was still thanking his wife for being praised by the chairman, not realizing that he was about to be betrayed by her. The day of the party soon arrived, and Rael appeared in a sparkling yellow dress. Guillaume, who had been longing for her day and night, was immediately captivated to the point where he could not stop looking in her direction. However, since his wife and Rael's husband were also present, Guillaume had to make a strong effort to suppress his feelings. During a game where all three of them bet everything, Guillaume revealed an unprecedented card. Everyone thought Rael Rael would give up, but unexpectedly, she once again captivated Guillaume. The dramatic turn of events left everyone astonished. At the moment Guillaume was feeling restless, he received an unexpected phone call. Earlier, a beautiful girl who had approached Guillaume was killed when his father-in-law ordered someone to run her over with a car. As a son-in-law, Guillaume was aware of the imminent danger. Meanwhile, Rael came to find him alone to present him with a tango piece she had played herself, and she teased him with her words. She said that when they danced together, when their hearts came closer, that she felt the emptiness in his heart and believed she was needed to fill that void. Confronted with the obvious Rael's avowal of love, Guillaume hesitated. On one hand, it was due to his father-in-law. On the other side, he sensed that Rael's intentions were far from simple. He told her that Rael was dangerous and that her actions seemed suspicious, so he needed to remain cautious and had no feelings for her, advising her not to approach him anymore. But remembering the grudge from 13 years ago over his father's death, Rael was not ready to give up. So she returned to Guillaume and told Guillaume that if he sensed the danger signal, that moreover, she could sense the man's feelings. In this way, Guillaume found himself in a state of intense internal conflict. After returning to the party, the enemy who had killed Rael's father years ago reappeared, and the scene of her father being beaten to death right before her eyes vividly resurfaced. But to avoid arousing the killer's suspicion, Rael could only force a smile. Unable to endure the malevolent grin of her enemy any longer, Rael made an excuse to leave and went to the rooftop. There she picked up a piece of wood and began to hurt on herself, as only pain could keep her alert at that moment. Unexpectedly, Guillaume witnessed this scene. Upon realizing he was there, Rael immediately covered the bloodstains on her dress and her body trembled with tension. When Guillaume asked what she was doing, Rael lied that she was just trying to trim some excess thread on her dress, but accidentally injured her leg. However, Guillaume seemed to sense something was off, so just as Rael attempted to leave, he pulled her back. He then took her to a secret room, carefully lifted her blood-stained skirt, and discovered the horrifying injuries. His gaze was filled with warmth, patiently helped her treat her wounds, and reassured Rael that she was the one who needed this melody of tango, because she was the one who needed healing. At that moment, Rael was struck by his words and stared blankly at Guillaume. An inexplicable feeling suddenly arose in her heart, and she desperately wished that he wasn't her enemy. However, after regaining her composure, Rael knew she had to leave quickly. As a result, she was stopped by Guillaume, who questioned her about what she was hiding and why she had so many old scars on her leg. Rael responded by saying that he didn't want others analyzing him, but now he was analyzing her. After saying this, she left the room. That night when she returned home, Rael refused her husband's offer. After he left the room, Rael sat on the bed in pain, and her memories went back to 13 years ago. It turned out that her current husband was one of the accomplices who had killed her father back then. This woman, in order to get revenge, actually bet her life on it. The next day, Rael went to the music store to ask the owner when this accordion will be taken to auction, and naturally, she wanted to buy it for Guillaume to win his heart. But unexpectedly, the owner said that this accordion was already pre-ordered by the richest man in Korea, named Guillaume. Just as Rael expressed her astonishment, Guillaume happened to arrive at the store. Seeing this, she said nothing and walked out because she knew he would make after her. Indeed, that soon after Guillaume chased for her and asked that why she wanted to buy that accordion. Fearing her plan would be exposed, Rael lied that she simply liked it. Guillaume immediately saw through her lie and asked what she was really hiding and what her true intentions were in approaching him. Feeling cornered, Rael silenced him with a kiss and told him not to think about trivial matters, but to be honest with each other. This kiss completely captivated Guillaume and also dispelled the doubts he had in his mind. Being a ballet teacher at the kindergarten, Rael had taken Guillaume's daughter home and accidentally stumbled into a hidden room in his working room. As soon as she entered the room, she saw shelves filled with money and gold bars, but these items did not move her heart. Her father had been beaten to death over a company dispute years ago, and the company's accounting records had been seized and were kept in Guillaume's house. After searching for a while, Rael discovered a shelf full of bribery records. As she picked up a list of cash transactions, at this time Guillaume happened to go home. Rael hurriedly put the documents back and ran out of the hidden room, but the door was very slow to close. Moreover, she saw Guillaume about to enter the room. She was anxious and pulled on the door with her hands. Then Guillaume opened the door. Fortunately, the hidden room door had managed to close in time. Rael, stressful, greeted Guillaume, and he seemed to have noticed something amiss, but said nothing, only instructing her to leave quickly. Although Rael did not find the evidence related to her father's death, but she also inadvertently had other materials. A moment ago, Rael had discovered a newspaper about the car accident that year on one of the shelves. It turned out that although Guillaume was the chairman of a conglomerate, his mother was not a distinguished lady, but just a babysitter for his father's home. After giving giving birth to Jeom, she was framed and killed in a car accident. On her way home, Rael was still shaken and frightened by what she had found. After catching her breath, she stopped the car, unable to believe that Guillaume's fate was as tragic as hers. Meanwhile, Guillaume was reflecting in his working room, recalling Rael's tense expression earlier. It seemed she had found something. Suddenly, he flipped through the newspaper on the shelf and found out that someone had touched it. He suspected that Rael had uncovered his background, a major secret that could affect his company's inheritance. Therefore, the next day, Guillaume nervously invited Rael and her husband to his home. While talking, Guillaume deliberately asked about the legend related to accordion music, as this piece of music was connected to his deceased mother. Indeed, after Rael heard this, her expression changed drastically. After going outside, she called a church in Italy, as only the godmother there knew this legend. Moreover, she had shared it exclusively with Rael. But unexpectedly, she told Rael that this legend was also told to a boy who had closed his heart much like Rael did after his mother's wrongful death. The boy's name was Guillaume. 8 years ago, when Rael left, then Guillaume had visited the church. It turned out that the two had unknowingly crossed paths in Italy 8 years prior. The connection between them was indeed extraordinary. Upon learning this, Rael developed a different feeling for Guillaume, shifting from mere vengeance to something deeper. In the backstage area of Rael's tango performance, Guillaume appeared once again. Rael reached out to draw the curtains, then gradually approached him. At this moment, she had forgotten her hatred and was filled only with love amidst the complexities with the man before her. She will not run away anymore. She said that she only needed him. However, unexpectedly, just as Rael was about to lose herself, that Guillaume pushed her to falling to the ground. Guillaume suspected that Rael was plotting something. At this point, Guillaume's heart was in deep conflict. On the one hand, Rael had completely stolen his heart, but when he thought of his mother, once a nursemaid to a wealthy family, because of seducing his father, she ended up dying unjustly. He didn't want Rael to end up like her. So in the end, Guillaume was in attempt to control himself. After returning home, Rael's mother asked if there had been any significant progress. But when she found out that Rael didn't even have Guillaume's phone number, she flew into a rage. She criticized Rael that she couldn't even handle a man. This statement immediately aroused Rael's anger. Rael snapped back then, telling her mother not to just sit there giving orders, as Rael had been the one putting herself out there, doing whatever it took to seduce a man she didn't even love, while her mother just stayed behind and said this and that. So the two turned their backs on each other in silence. The next day, Rael went to her dance class. Recalling the words Guillaume had said the previous day when he pushed her down, Rael couldn't help but feel awful. To distract herself from her emotions, she turned on the music and started dancing. But suddenly sweat poured out like rain, and she didn't know that all of this was seen by Pyong, who happened to come over, saw Rael's mysterious appearance right in front. Pyong couldn't help but recall the suffering she had endured. Even the sweat on her forehead revealed the pain she was feeling. When Pyong looked at her heartbrokenly and was about to go forwards Rael, a round of applause interrupted. It turned out to be So-ra. Eager to impress her father, So-ra had asked Pyong, a presidential candidate, to attend her birthday party. However, he seemed to ignore her request and only had eyes for Rael. So-ra smirked, having noticed Pyong's true intentions. She then turned to invite Rael. Unexpectedly, as soon as Rael agreed, then Pyong also nodded immediately. That night, Rael drove So-ra home, but she saw a man covered in blood in her villa, which was the fate of those who opposed the country's leading chaebol family. Seeing their nonchalant demeanor, Rael was involuntarily reminded of the scene when her father was tortured years ago, which was exactly like the man before her. Just as tears were about to fall, then she was interrupted by a bodyguard. After regaining her composure, Rael followed the bodyguard to the villa's living room, then used the excuse of a burnt hand to send him away. She then secretly placed a listening device under the table and overheard a secret that So-ra's family planned to frame Pyong by investing money in him and then exploiting the opportunity to harm him. At that moment, the bodyguard returned, but fortunately, Rael was smart enough not to get caught. As Rael was about to leave, that she ran into Guillaume, greeted him with a nod, but only to find that Guillaume seemed determined to sever ties with her. After returning home, her mother was very pleased with the listening device Rael had installed. But when thinking about Guillaume's growing suspicion towards Rael, made the mother feel awful. However, she remained confident because she already had a plan to win Guillaume's heart. The birthday party of the top chaebol was so extravagant that even presidential candidate attended, and Pyong's presence astonished everyone. This humble congressman suddenly appeared at a chaebol's party, and all of this was thanks to Rael. Seeing Rael at the party in a white dress, Guillaume's gaze was once again captivated. His hands even became numb, and his mind went completely blank until Rael approached him, that bringing him back to his senses. Seeing that she play in the role of interpreter, even saw a wealthy Italian businessman kiss her hand, which suddenly filled him with anger, but he managed to suppress it. Rael then introduced everyone to the wealthy businessman in Italian, but overlooked Guillaume's older brother, who was competing for the inheritance with Guillaume. As the son of the Kang family, when she saw her husband being ignored, the wife, who had a special status, immediately felt dissatisfied. But she did not understand Italian, so she was subjected to So-ra's taunts. What they did not realize was that this was the beginning of Rael's plan for the day. She deliberately acted this way to attract the attention of Guillaume's older brother. As expected, he approached Rael alone. Within a few sentences, he began to make physical advances. Seeing that Rael did not resist at all, he became even bolder, touching her back and slowly caressing it. This scene happened to be seen by Guillaume, who was not far away. Although he appeared calm on the outside, but Rael could tell that he had taken the bait. Nevertheless, she ignored Guillaume and continued to flirt with Kang Si-jo because she was waiting for Guillaume to get jealous. Meanwhile, So-ra did not notice her husband's distraction and even was immersed in happiness, then taking the opportunity to ask him for a gift. At this moment, the sister-in-law approached So-ra. Why invite a lowly girl like Rael here? Because So-ra greatly disliked her sister-in-law, so she deliberately taunted her. The arguments between these women only fueled Guillaume's anger further. He couldn't stop glaring at Rael and Kang Si-guillaume, and if looks could kill, his older brother would have died countless times. Seeing Kang Si-guillaume's increasingly outrageous behavior, Guillaume finally couldn't hold back anymore, slammed his glass down, and went straight over to say that his brother was drunk. However, Kang Si-guillaume insisted that he was not drunk, originally intending to assert his power in front of Rael, but Kang Si-guillaume was suddenly infuriated by the interruption. He ignored his younger brother's words, immediately dragged Rael away. Guillaume disregarded the onlookers and pushed Kang Si-guillaume to the ground, then pulling Rael away. After they were in a private place, Guillaume went crazy and told her about his jealousy, which was exactly what Rael wanted to see, both proving her position in Guillaume's heart and also breaking up the relationship between the two cousins. Rael then played a game of soft coercion with him, deliberately saying things that would fuel his jealousy even more. She then asked Guillaume if he wanted to be by her side. Seeing Guillaume's infatuated gaze, Rael slipped a room key into his pocket and told him that he only had one chance. If he wanted her, he had to obediently crawl like a dog. At that moment, Guillaume was truly ensnared by Rael's charms. Meanwhile, at the wealthy family's estate, the bodyguards not only work hard, but also have to serve and kiss the madam's feet. Suddenly, the madam boss pushed the guard down on the bed because her husband called to urge her to come home quickly to prepare for having another child. Delighted, she picked up a mirror to fix her disheveled appearance, but as a result, that she discovered a red mark on her neck, which made her furious. She began to curse at the bodyguard, while he could only lower his head in silence. She anxiously touched up her makeup with a bit of powder and went home feeling guilty, directly covering her neck with her hand. She then preemptively explained that her flushed face was due to having just eaten spicy food. Guillaume was not in the mood at this time. He just said goodnight and went back to his room. She breathed a sigh of relief, as it turned out that during the family clan's ritual the previous day, the father-in-law knew that his daughter-in-law So-ra was almost 50 years old, so he threatened her. If she couldn't give birth to a son, that she wouldn't be able to inherit the family's property. After that, she was ridiculed by her young and beautiful sister-in-law. Since she had never suffered injustice before, how could So-ra endure this humiliation? When she saw her sister-in-law approaching, then she deliberately broke a bowl, causing her sister-in-law to step on the shards and bleed. The commotion drew everyone's attention. Seeing this, the husband called her out and scolded her harshly. So-ra was well aware that her husband had long lost interest in her and had not touched her for years, making the prospect of having a child as difficult as reaching the heavens. But now if she cannot bear a son, then she won't be able to inherit the family's fortune, so she had no choice but to seek Rael's help. Originally intending to take revenge on So-ra's entire family, Rael agreed immediately upon hearing this, seeing it as a perfect opportunity to provoke the couple. So she persuaded So-ra to learn tango. She said that dancing could not only exercise the body, but they would also hold a performance at the kindergarten next, and by then Guillaume would be able to change his mind when he saw his wife perform brilliantly on stage. So-ra was almost 50 years old, so she basically didn't want to learn things of such high difficulty, but was enticed by Rael's sweet words. Consequently, So-ra attended the dance class the next day. Rael even arranged for several handsome dance partners for So-ra to choose from. However, being the lady of oligarchs, So-ra was quite concerned about her social image and initially hesitated to select any of them. She even mocked two parents she she considered lowly for flirting with the dance partners. After hearing Rael's comments, So-ra had a realization and decided that if she wanted to get pregnant sooner than her sister-in-law, she should practice dancing with the dance partners there. Breaking the order and obtaining everything under the invitation of her dance partner, So-ra began to lower her guard. After a while, her face was filled youthfulness. Dancing with a handsome man was indeed quite enjoyable. Seeing her flushed cheeks, it seemed the issue of the family inheritance would soon be resolved. While So-ra was in her dance class, Rael suggested that she could organize a tango party. Imagining herself dancing at the party and winning her husband's affection, So-ra immediately agreed. When she returned home, she instructed the servants not to reveal this secret, planning to surprise her husband. Upon learning that Guillaume was preparing a sweet hotel room for her, So-ra was overjoyed. When she entered her husband's room, she mentioned how much she was looking forward to the next evening, but she didn't notice that her husband wasn't paying any attention to her words. In the next scene, So-ra wakes up and sluggishly walks downstairs. She discovered that the house was not decorated with flowers and ribbons as she had imagined. Instead, there was only a group of servants awkwardly holding a cake and singing the birthday song. It turned out that Guillaume had gone out, which made So-ra so furious that she knocked over the cake. However, this hasn't dampened her hope for her birthday party yet. When she took her daughter to school, the principal, in order to win her favor, that specially arranged lunch for her, but was laughed at by So-ra, saying that the principal was not worthy to invite her. Afterwards, So-ra went to her dance class, but was told by Rael that she couldn't attend the birthday party because she had an appointment with Pyong. Once Rael left the class, she called two parents who happened to be So-ra's sworn enemies. If Rael wasn't going, then they would also leave So-ra alone. Meanwhile, when So-ra arrived at the dance hall full of high hopes that she found the room completely empty, she waited from noon until 7 p.m., but no one showed up. So-ra furiously stormed out and immediately called her secretary, unleashing all her anger on them. Fortunately, the secretary informed her that Guillaume had booked a room at a hotel and was waiting for her. She was then rushed to the hotel. Meanwhile, Guillaume was still at the hotel waiting for his wife to arrive, but his mind was constantly thinking about what Rael had said when he gave him the room card that night. If he refused, there would be no second chance. In the end, he made his decision. He ordered his staff to cancel the birthday party and drove straight to Rael's hotel, even turning off his phone on the way. Then, So-ra brought her last bit of hope to the hotel, but found that there was no birthday atmosphere at all, and even her husband was nowhere to be seen. After a day of being deceived, So-ra was utterly devastated. At the same time, Guillaume arrived at Rael's hotel. Rael had already changed into her nightwear and waited for him to arrive. In fact, the choice Guillaume made had long been anticipated by Rael. Her alluring eyes and soft hands gently stroked Guillaume's face, along with the seductive fragrance from her body, hard for any man to resist. Rael walked toward the bathtub, where the man waiting for her was none other than the son-in-law of the enemy she had thought about day and night for the past 13 years. For those 13 years, she had considered herself merely a tool, willing to use her body to lure her enemies, and finally on this day, her plan was nearing success. Soon she would bring the entire Chaebol family to its knees. Meanwhile, Guillaume's wife was crying at home. The birthday party she had looked forward to for so long, only for her husband to suddenly disappear. She even foolishly called her father for help. After complaining to her father about the injustice she had suffered, all she received was scolding from her father. At this moment, So-ra felt like an orphan abandoned by the entire world. She cried in despair, which even frightened the household staff. They couldn't believe that the once domineering lady of the house had reached such a low point. Then she held on to her last bit of hope and called Rael to tell him her troubles, because now there was no one else by her side. Meanwhile, Rael pretended to comfort her, telling So-ra that if she could secure the department store project from her Chaebol father, she could reclaim everything. Upon hearing this, So-ra became emotional, also said that later he would let Rael be vice president. After hanging up the phone, she held on to a sliver of hope to call her husband, but as expected, his phone was turned off. Because he had no intention of answering, as he was soaking in a bathtub and slowly caressing the woman in front of him, the one he had long desired. Finally, he had Rael. After spending a night together with his enemy, this was merely the first step in Rael's plan. Next, she would help Guillaume reach the pinnacle of his career, and then use him to destroy the entire Chaebol family. But no matter how meticulous her plan was, the love in her heart was difficult to control. Watching Guillaume sleep beside her, Rael slowly reached out to caress his face. In this moment, she wished he weren't her enemy, but simply her lover. How wonderful that would be. Yet fate had its cruel ways, and the grudge of her father's murder was still deeply etched in her mind, so she quickly withdrew her hand. Meanwhile, So-ra had been abandoned by her husband at her birthday party last night, waiting all night until 5 a.m., but he still hadn't returned. So she was furious, but the only person she could vent to was her secretary. However, the most unfortunate one one was her husband's secretary, who ended up getting slapped for no apparent reason. Meanwhile, Guillaume had just woken up and saw Rael still lying beside him. He felt like he hadn't slept so peacefully in the past 5 years. Before leaving, Guillaume gave Rael a private phone, explaining that his own phone had been bugged by his wife. Besides, he also gifted her a diamond necklace worth millions of dollars. And of course, Rael still had to pretend to be incredibly surprised. When Guillaume returned home, he was met with a chaotic scene and a group of trembling servants. Guillaume spoke first without waiting for his wife to ask. He told Sora that how many times he had needed to say it, a maid was not a slave. When Sora would stop this cursing and beating, but under his wife's questioning, Guillaume finally said he was tired of Sora so much. At that moment, Sora couldn't believe what she had just heard, but the heartache she felt proved it all. Before she could ask the next question, Guillaume had already headed straight to his room. Unwilling to accept it, Sora chased after him and discovered that he was going to sleep in the guest room. He told her that he no longer wanted to share a bed with her. The conversation between the two was being transmitted to Rael's ears through the hacking software installed on Guillaume's phone. At this point, Rael had successfully driven a wedge between their relationship, and the next step was to deal with the husband who had once betrayed her father. Rael pretended to receive a package. When she mentioned the sender's name and was about to open the box, the husband's expression immediately changed. The sender's name was none other than Rael's deceased father, so he immediately lied that it must have been delivered to the wrong person. But his reaction was exactly what Rael and her mother had anticipated. The purpose of faking the delivery was to trap the husband in their scheme. Indeed, the next day, the husband rushed out to find the enemy who had been involved in the murder of Rael's father years ago, and the entire scene of him was captured by someone Rael had arranged. Rael, who was in the eavesdropping room, heard all the enemy's secret plans. This was the evidence to put them in jail. How terrifying are women who are desperate in love. Just because her husband suggested they sleep in separate rooms, Sora decided to destroy the adjoining bedrooms. However, she was unaware that the person she trusted most was actually the mistress who had seduced her husband. On top of that, this woman directed all her frustration toward her daughter and forcing the little girl to call her father and demand that he return home. The child was so frightened that she burst into tears. So Rael pretended to be a good person and took Sora's phone to call Guillaume. But when Guillaume saw his wife calling, that he directly ignored her. It wasn't until Rael took out their secret phone to call that Guillaume became extremely excited. When he returned home and saw the mess on the floor, the first person Guillaume showed concern for was not his wife, but asking if she was hurt. Fortunately, Rael stayed calm and immediately so she called Sora over. Upon seeing the husband who had driven her to madness, Sora picked up a plate and threw it at him, causing it to shatter and scatter everywhere. Guillaume's instinctive reaction was to protect Rael, not his daughter who was standing nearby. Thankfully, Rael quickly pulled him toward their daughter to preventing Sora from noticing any slip-up. Later, when they returned to the room, Rael comforted Sora while secretly adding sleeping pills to her drink. Sora is almost 50 years old and is really stupid. She still thinks she can win her father's company's project, then let Rael be vice president. After a day of destruction, Sora soon fell into a deep sleep. Once Guillaume knew his wife was sound asleep, he tended to Rael's wounds without hesitation, showing her such tenderness as though he felt no guilt towards his wife. His only concern seemed to be whether the wound would leave a scar on Rael's face. Meanwhile, Rael continued to weave her seductive charm. Not only did she carefully prepare a meal for Guillaume, but she also performed an incredibly captivating tango. Watching her seductive eyes and graceful hair flowing as she danced, Guillaume was completely captivated. He immediately pulled her into his arms. Perhaps there was once some conflict in this man's heart, but actually Rael herself was also torn. She wanted revenge, but feared that she might actually fall in love with this man. After returning home, she eagerly discussed with her mother, planning to bring Guillaume and his father-in-law to court as soon as possible. Let's see just how generous this K-Ball's wife really is, she thought. Facing two male models she had just met, she casually handed each of them 100 million won. Tat made the two models could hardly believe their eyes, but the wife told them that the money was for seducing two particular women for one night, and they had to take pictures as proof. The people who could push Sora to seek revenge at any cost were these two women from this powerful family. These two not only didn't just abandon Sora at her own birthday party, but also now giving her a gift meant to humiliate her. When the secretary opened the gift box, she was so frightened by what was inside that she almost dropped it, causing everyone to burst into laughter. As the daughter of the Prime Minister of South Korea, there was no way Sora could swallow such an insult. Ruining their reputations would be the lightest form of punishment because anyone who had offended Sora before had ended up being killed by hitmen she hired. While talking to Sora, Sora, Rael uncovered a terrifying secret. Before Sora married Guillaume, there was a beautiful girl who was in a romantic relationship with him, and that girl turned out to be the biological daughter of the woman currently working with Rael. To eliminate her competition, Sora had personally dealt with her. Additionally, after Sora's family stole Rael's father's company, Rael's mother had always wanted to reclaim it, but in the end, Sora had murdered her with her own hands. Upon hearing this, Rael's mind went blank immediately. She had always believed her mother had simply disappeared back then, but never had she imagined that Sora had killed her. After returning home, she finally let out the deep pain hidden within her. At that moment, she wanted nothing more than to grab a knife and kill her enemy, but reason told her that it was not yet the right time. With the torment gnawing at her heart, she could only let the rain wash over to cleanse her mind. Luckily, Pyong arrived just in time to comfort her. Seeing Rael's silent sobs, Pyong understood the weight of what she was enduring. This reminded him of the painful days he had gone through when he first met Rael. And from that moment on, he made up his mind. Even if this was a path of no return, even if he had to bet his entire future on it, he would forever help Rael to the end. The next day, when Peng's assistant came to inform him that Rael had refused to help him arrange a meeting with Sora's father, but unexpectedly he surprisingly agreed to meet him anyway. Pyong understood that in order to help Rael, he had to approach her enemy and join forces with him. As the richest man in Korea, but when he met his father, that he got a slap in the face, then he was scared and knelt down. It turned out that Guillaume was merely an illegitimate child, and his father scolded him for daring to compete in business with his older brother. His father reminded him not to forget that his mother was just a nanny, so he showed great disdain for him. Moreover, he forced Guillaume to sign papers renouncing his inheritance rights. Hearing his father insult his mother, Guillaume trembled with rage and completely lost his composure. Meanwhile, since Rael had learned that Sora had killed her mother, she had been completely emotionally shattered, but the revenge plan still had to be carried out, so she had no choice but to attend the kindergarten performance alongside Sora. In the dressing room, Sora brought her father and subordinates to meet Rael. Because the plan Rael had previously taught Sora was particularly valuable, her father wanted to recruit Rael to his side. When he saw Rael, he felt he hadn't misjudged her, and his eyes revealed compliment. However, as Rael looked at the three enemies before her, a mixture of fear and hatred made her hands tremble uncontrollably, but she still forced herself to smile at them. Luckily, the three of them left right after greeting each other. Otherwise, it would be difficult to guarantee that Rael wouldn't reveal any flaws after. On stage, Rael wore a black suit and danced with Sora. Rael's sexy body and perfect demeanor made her win endless applause from the audience. However, as she looked at the woman in front of her, memories of her father's tragic death resurfaced. After a difficult performance, Rael stepped off the stage before the show ended, unable to bear it any longer. In the corridor, she struggled to hold back her tears, trying not to cry out loud. At that moment, Guillaume approached. It turned out he had not signed the agreement earlier. When Rael asked about the injury on his face, he said he was just an ordinary person, but was under an illusion as a king. But now he wanted to truly become a king. He vowed to crush anyone who tried to trample him, to take over LY Corporation and become a king. Then Guillaume wanted to confirm with Rael that whether she would stay by his side forever and never betray him. Rael gently caressed Guillaume's face and assured him that no matter what happened, she would always be by his side. At that moment, Rael realized that if Guillaume was no longer her enemy and had the power of a king, it was time to speak directly to Sora and confront her. Rael informed Sora that her husband was having an affair. This immediately reminded Sora of the day her husband had abandoned her on her birthday. Although she pretended to remain calm on the outside, but she was seething with turmoil inside. She continually washed her hands with hot water, unaware that her skin had turned red and burned. In a frantic state, she demanded that Rael provide proof of her husband's infidelity and threatened Rael not to falsely accuse her husband. As she watched Sora leave, Rael decided to reveal the harsh truth to her. That night, Rael arranged for Guillaume to stay over and planned in detail how to help him regain his shares in the company. Once again, Guillaume was captivated by her talent. As Rael stroked Guillaume's scar, then she vaguely realized something within her heart. It seemed that she had fallen in love with this man. Meanwhile, Sora also received the news that her husband wasn't coming home. She remembered Rael's words from the morning, which made her so angry that her entire body was trembling uncontrollably. She yelled that she was freezing and scolded the servants to bring a whole set of heaters for her. Despite this, even with her hands shaking from the cold, Sora reapplied her lipstick and instructed the servants to add more heaters, causing them to nearly overheat. Meanwhile, her husband Guillaume was happily with Rael. The next day, Sora could no longer endure and went to see Rael, asking if she had found evidence of Guillaume's infidelity. Rael did not answer, but instead found a reason to lure Sora to the company. At that moment, moment, Guillaume was in a meeting. Because he was so fed up with his old wife, he immediately told his bodyguards not to let anyone near him, including his wife. So Ra had no choice but to wait for him in the office. While Sora was distracted, then Rael discovered eyeshadow on Guillaume's suit, and unexpectedly, she directly told Sora about it. Seeing this, Sora could hardly believe her eyes. She covered her mouth with her hand, and her breath became so rapid that she was almost unable to breathe. She then cornered Rael against the wall and demanded to know whose eyeshadow this was, even if it was randomly mentioning a person, because right now Sora was so crazy that wanted to find someone to vent her anger on. This furious reaction from Sora was exactly what Rael had anticipated, as the eyeshadow was something Rael had deliberately applied that night. Just as Sora was about to suffocate Rael with her rage, Guillaume arrived in time to save her. With no outlet for her anger, Sora could only direct it at the table, shattering glass fragments. Even as the glass flew around, Guillaume's focus remained solely on Rael. The more Sora lost control, the more Guillaume grew disgusted with her. After Sora was taken out by her subordinates, Rael asked Guillaume if he was hurt, and he took the opportunity to hug her, but he didn't expect that this scene was seen by Rael's husband. Rael had deliberately called her husband to the company to ensure he saw this, as part of her plan to execute her revenge from 13 years ago. After returning home, the husband was extremely angry and grabbed Rael's hand and questioned her, asking what her relationship with Guillaume was. Rael pulled his hand away. Seeing the red mark on Rael's hand, she immediately revealed a look of disdain. Up to now, for her revenge plan, this husband, who was an accomplice of the enemy, was no longer of any use. Moreover, as Rael had developed feelings for Guillaume, she increasingly loathed her husband, so she revealed everything without a shred of sympathy for him. Despite realizing that Rael had betrayed him, the husband, when seeing her attempt to move out, still begging her on his knees not to leave. At this moment, Rael laughed at the husband's hypocrisy. Even now, with everything having reached this point, that he still pretended. If that year it hadn't been for him, how could her father's company have easily fallen into the hands of others back then? Meanwhile, Sora, after seeing the eyeshadow of the mistress on her husband's clothes, that she had lost her mental composure. Even while washing her hands, she could see the glittering remnants on her skin. The bodyguard who once cared for her came to check on her, but was misunderstood by Sora as mocking her. Unable to endure any longer, she decided to tell her father so he could punish her son-in-law. However, she was prevented by his subordinates, as Pyong was visiting their house at that moment. To help Rael, Pyong had deliberately put himself in danger by accepting a bribe and agreeing to participate in the chairman's money laundering project. Seeing that her father couldn't offer any help, then Sora called Rael to ask for assistance. Rael immediately provided intelligence, which turned out to be a photo of a parent from the preschool, and the limited edition bag in the woman's hand was a gift directly from Guillaume. Quickly, Pyong was about to leave when the father called Sora to see Pyong off. That Rael also came out. After leaving the tycoon's mansion, the two went straight to Pyong's house. In here, he prepared a meal for her, and she hurriedly asked him why he accepted to do bad things just because for her. He replied that he had no family since he was young. Pyong explained that Rael's father had raised him through his education, and after when Rael's father had passed away, Rael was his only family. So let he help her, and he would do anything he could, and even at any costs. At this point, Rael was deeply moved by his commitment. The next day, Sora went to the preschool and happened to see two parents discussing the topic of love with her dance partner. However, when Sora saw the handbag in one of the parents' hands, then she became tense. Just can see that she approached step by step, causing the woman to turn pale with fear. Seeing the glitter on the other parent's eyes, Sora immediately felt dizzy. After several days of failing to find the person who seduced her husband, Rael called and informed Sora that her husband was buying a car with another woman. Moreover, she also sent the actual location of the car. It was clear that this was a trap set by Rael. When Rael hung up, that she revealed a satisfied smile. It turns out that Guillaume specially sent a bodyguard for Rael to protect her, and also arranged for her a luxury car. After calling the bodyguard to pick her up at home, she called Sora to report the bodyguard's location. After ending the call, Sora and her bodyguard set off in pursuit. As the bodyguard accelerated to catch up, then they eventually located the car. After realizing they were being followed, the professional bodyguard made sure not to make it easy for Sora to catch up. Consequently, both cars staged a dramatic high-speed chase. Due to the heavily tinted windows, Sora couldn't clearly see the face inside the car. In a near frenzy, she ordered her bodyguard to ram the vehicle. After a loud crash, that both cars came to a halt in the middle of the road. Sora was stabbed to the point that his head was spinning. She didn't even bother to think about the pain, then immediately got out of the car and pulled open the door of the opposite car. But when the other party rolled down the car window, it was the company's female bodyguard. Sora felt like she was being played, but before she could get angry that she heard the police siren, so she ran away. And Rael was on this side. Since moving out of the house, she had been sitting in her surveillance room, watching her daughter sleep alone on the sofa. She feel not having heart to do that. So many things had happened in the past few days that she was utterly exhausted and eventually fell asleep, only to have a terrible nightmare. Upon waking up, she burst into tears, not because out of fear, but because the years of living so painfully had worn her down. Meanwhile, Guillaume was aware of the issues the bodyguards faced and, enraged by being sent away by Rael, shouted at the bodyguards to leave immediately. He anxiously rushed to his and Rael's secret base, but didn't see Rael there, so he then sent her text message. But Rael, when seeing the message, that she felt immense discomfort. She clearly loved Guillaume, but the hatred in her heart told her otherwise. As the leading chaebol's wife in South Korea, but Sora had chosen to flee after colliding with another car. At this time, the media was in a frenzy, and the incident had plunged the entire chaebol family into chaos. Everyone had their own motives, and all fear that at this time they will be caught up in a conspiracy behind their backs. When her husband Guillaume came to Sora and questioned her why she caused trouble, but unexpectedly that Sora questioning him first, asking who the woman he was having an affair with was, Guillaume hesitated for a second before denying the affair. But Sora's sixth sense was highly perceptive. She could tell from her husband's eyes that he was lying. Seeing that her husband refused to admit the truth, Sora agreed to undergo a police investigation. At the police station, even the chief showed great respect towards the top chaebol's wife of South Korea. He first apologized for requiring her to come in person, but due to media pressure, he had to proceed with the investigation. However, when asked about the events at the scene of the car accident, Sora shockingly claimed that her car had been stolen. She then produced a photo of the car key that Rael had taken for her that day, and said that both cars were hers. At the same time, she demanded that the police investigate the information about the driver who had been hit. At this moment, the cunning vice chairman beside her was also taken aback. He did not expect Sora to be so devious. Guillaume could no longer remain calm. Rearing that his affair with Rael might be exposed, he instructed his subordinates to hide the damaged car and immediately sent his bodyguards abroad. Meanwhile, Rael, who was behind all this, remained completely unfazed. Peng then called Rael and said that no matter what decision she made, he would support her unconditionally. However, Rael asked him what if she turned into a monster and did something cruel. Peng responded without hesitation and saying it was fine to proceed. Meanwhile, Sora quickly obtained the information about the driver of the car involved in the accident from the police. Despite being beaten badly and covered in blood, the bodyguard refused to reveal who the woman Guillaume was protecting was until he was beaten unconscious. So Ra immediately asked a person to take out her phone and indeed found the number labeled as VIP, which was clearly her husband's mistress. Unable to wait, she immediately called the number to inquire about the identity of the person. Rael did not speak, but instead sent a message to Sora, saying she would appear at noon the next day, with the condition that the innocent bodyguard be released first. However, the next day was also come with Sora's daughter's birthday, and reporters from the kindergarten arrived at the scene one after another. As the media swarmed to take photos, Sora had no intention of posing, and instead stared intently at the clock on the wall. She had arranged for her secretary to guard all exits at the kindergarten, determined to catch the mistress. At that moment, Guillaume's appearance drew everyone's attention, and the two pretended to continue to display their affectionate behavior in front of the media. After inviting Guillaume to speak, the party reached its climax. So Ra glanced at the wall clock once again. 12 o'clock had struck, and Rael finally made her appearance. She was wearing the expensive billion-won necklace that Guillaume had given her, and combined with her cold expression and the high-end blue short dress, she exuded an air that made everyone hold their breath. It wasn't until she smiled that the two wealthy women dared to approach and greet her. Rael even deliberately glanced at Guillaume and looked him straight in the eyes. So Ra then asked her secretary if there were any unfamiliar faces present, as she still did not suspect that the mistress was Rael, who was familiar like a sister to her. When Rael approached Sora, that she pretended not to know what was going on and asked if the mistress had been found. At this point, Sora angrily cursed the mistress as a turtle hiding its head. Rael tilted her head and started speaking in a different tone, saying that who had said she had been scared and ran away also said that, wasn't I here now? After saying this, Rael even flaunted the necklace Guillaume had given her, leaving Sora bewildered. Sora was shocked and turned to Guillaume with an expression of disbelief. At this point, Guillaume was still unaware that Rael had revealed everything to his wife. The harsh truth made Sora's hands tremble uncontrollably. She then asked Rael to confirm again, and Rael told her that Sora's birthday was also the first night she and Guillaume had been intimate. So Ra immediately recalled that on her birthday, her husband hadn't come home all night while she went mad alone in the house. Seeing Sora on the verge of collapse, Rael continued to taunt her. At this point, Sora could no longer hold herself together. Fortunately, that the appearance of reporters helped contain her fury. After Rael moved towards the crowd, Guillaume was unable to endure the longing for her that went to pull her hand. However, Rael unexpectedly proposed breaking up with him, citing that Sora had discovered their affair. As Guillaume turned around, that he saw the sharp gaze of his wife. After the party ended, Rael was about to leave when Sora chased after her and threatening to kill Rael. Facing Sora's threats, Rael remained disdainful. She said that Sora's husband had cheated because he had grown tired of her. Rael's strong demeanor left Sora's mind in turmoil. Although Sora was the wife, but she now found herself at a loss for words to counter Rael. At this moment, Sora enraged in the car and said she wanted to find her father to kill Rael. However, she was unaware that her husband's heart had been taken by Rael, so he threatened Sora, stating that if she harmed even a single hair on Rael, he would not spare her. Upon hearing this, Sora was completely devastated. She could not believe that after 5 years of marriage, her husband could become so cold-hearted because of a mistress he had only known for 3 months. When she got out of the car, she gave her husband a look full of grievance, not knowing that he was planning an even greater scheme. The next day, under the media's watchful eyes, Guillaume made a grand announcement of the listing of a company in which he owned 100% of the shares. Upon seeing this news, both Guillaume's father and Sora's father could no longer sit still. They knew very well that once Guillaume rose to prominence, his next step would be to overthrow all those who had previously suppressed him. The two elderly men hurried to Guillaume's company, but to their surprise, they were stopped by the security guards. With no place to vent their anger, the two elders began to criticize each other for failing to control their own descendants. After a while, the situation escalated into a physical altercation. Despite being nearly 70 years old, these top figures in Korean business were fighting in front of everyone. On the other side, Rael, when realizing that Sora had shown no mercy towards her security guard, reluctantly begged Pyong to rescue the guard and even took the initiative to visit her in the hospital. The security guard, who had been beaten badly and remained loyal, would eventually become a valuable ally for Rael. Meanwhile, Guillaume was hosting a celebration at his company. After making arrangements for his staff, he rushed to Rael's house and eager to see her. Even if just for a brief moment, he could no longer endure the intense longing. Despite Guillaume's plea, Rael refused him because she had a larger plan in mind. She was waiting for Guillaume and Sora to torment each other until they could no longer bear it, because when people are pushed to their limits, they often act irrationally. Seeing that Rael refused to meet him, Guillaume could only return to the company. However, unexpectedly that Rael sent him a gift. When Guillaume opened it, he discovered it was a accordion, which intensified his longing for her. Just as he was about to lose his mind from missing Rael, then she appeared. Guillaume eagerly embraced her, pleading with her not to break up with him, as the chairman of a conglomerate, but now he had to beg others. Just when Guillaume was about to lose himself, Rael's husband saw this scene. The two men almost got into a fight because of Rael, and it was not hard to guess that the husband's appearance at this crucial moment was a deliberate arrangement by Rael. Her goal was to provoke Guillaume's possessiveness and force him to divorce Sora. Guillaume then ordered his bodyguards to drag the husband away. When Rael used the excuse that Sora had discovered their relationship to demand that Guillaume sever all ties with her, Guillaume responded that he would handle the matters in his home. Rael left a message saying she would wait for him and immediately walked away, leaving Guillaume standing there alone. After returning home, the husband threw all of Rael's belongings outside. It turned out that these items were all clothes she had worn when meeting Guillaume. When the husband discovered the $1,000,000,000 necklace that Guillaume had given her, his anger intensified. He vowed to confront Guillaume in a showdown. After the husband left, Rael revealed a triumphant smile. At that moment, her mother entered and warned her that with things having escalated to this point, it meant their plans had been exposed. If Guillaume did not divorce Sora and her identity was revealed, then she would never be able to exact her revenge. On the surface, Rael appeared very confident, but she was soon plagued by a nightmare in which she found herself trapped in an inescapable hell. And in the fog, she saw herself killing her enemies with her own hands. But when she saw her hands stained with fresh blood, she was terrified and jolted awake. At that moment, Pyong called to her, having learned that Rael had revealed her identity to Sora. He feared that she might be retaliated against. The next day, the kindergarten held a celebration for Sora, which was essentially a show of flattery because they had learned that Guillaume's company was listed. When Rael arrived at the kindergarten, she was surprised to find that Sora was still intent on holding a meeting. To clear up any suspicions that Rael went to the meeting room. As soon as she encountered Sora, the atmosphere in the room became extremely tense. Sora ordered her secretary to expel Rael, but of course, Rael refused to leave, as she still had not clarified where Sora's confidence was coming from. Everyone was puzzled, not understand what happened, wondering why the two sisters who had been so close before were suddenly at odds like this. this. Suddenly a loud slap echoed through the room that's startling everyone. Before anyone could react, that another slap followed. However, Rael didn't appear angry at all. Instead, she feigned innocence and asked So-ra why she was upset. At this moment, Rael was deliberately provoking So-ra, testing whether she would dare to mention her husband's affair in front of everyone. As expected, So-ra didn't. She simply turned to the others and explained that there had been some friction between herself and Rael at the party. Upon hearing this, Rael smirked condescendingly and walked away, because she knew that So-ra would seek her out again. True to her expectations, after the meeting, So-ra called Rael aside. During their conversation, So-ra intentionally mentioned how Guillaume had apologized to her the night before and how happy they were together. She even said that thanks to Rael, she had successfully taken over the department company project. Hearing this, Rael was stunned. Things were not unfolding according to her plan at all. But the most unexpected twist was still to come. When Guillaume arrived, he held So-ra's hand in an unusually affectionate manner, to the extent that it seemed their marital relationship was as strong as ever. Rael deliberately glanced at Guillaume, but to her surprise, he completely ignored her and walked away holding So-ra's hand. At this moment, Rael felt incredibly distressed and began to feel a sense of despair. After returning home, she and Pyong watched Guillaume and his wife at the company's press conference on TV. Pyong told her that the situation was now beyond control, as all of So-ra's previous enemies had been dealt with in an unusual manner. He advised Rael to temporarily set aside her grievances and lay low to avoid this storm. However, Rael did not show any fear. She said that even if something unfortunate were to happen to her, she only asked Pyong to help her mother. Seeing the woman consumed by hatred before him, Pyong was deeply pained and finally revealed the 3 words he had kept hidden all along: "I love you." But Rael was fundamentally unable to give him an answer. However, Pyong said that he did not need an answer from her and would fully support her revenge plan at any cost, as long as she could stay safe. He told her that if she ever felt overwhelmed, she could come to him for support at any time and not suffer alone. As for whether she would accept his confession, he said he would wait until she had completed her revenge to ask her again. At that very moment, her mother played a dirty trick. She sent someone to inform Guillaume that Rael was the daughter of his enemy. Fortunately, Pyong discovered this in time. On the way to work, Pyong happened to see a man approaching Guillaume. Recognizing that this man was one of the victims from years ago, Pyong immediately thought that if he followed Guillaume, he might discover something. Indeed, at the hotel entrance, he saw the man handing an envelope to Guillaume. Just as Guillaume was about to open it, then Pyong managed to get out of the car and stop him. Then, under the pretext of discussing work, he invited Guillaume for a drink. While Guillaume was reviewing the documents Pyong had given him in the office, Pyong secretly called Rael and instructed her to distract Guillaume. He then put the documents into his bag while no one was watching. On the other side, as Guillaume answered Rael's call, he immediately explained why he hadn't smiled at her at the kindergarten. He said it was because So-ra was present. Moreover, since his company had just been listed, he couldn't afford any scandals. He then invited Rael to meet him at the hotel. Hearing the word hotel, Rael was reminded of So-ra's comment that Guillaume was merely trying to satisfy his temporary desires. As Rael was conflicted internally, her mother came in to warn her not to ruin her 13-year plan for the sake of love. Meanwhile, after obtaining the documents, Pyong immediately called Rael over. Upon opening the documents, Rael was devastated, as they contained only photos of her from when she was a child, along with secrets about her true identity. If these were discovered by Guillaume, it would mean she actually had to die. Pyong quickly deduced that the only person who could know everything about Rael was her mother. At this point, Rael was almost going insane. Her revenge plan was already faltering, and now she had been betrayed by the person she trusted the most. Perhaps before, apart from her outward pretense, Rael had inadvertently revealed some emotions and compassion. But from this moment on, she had completely become corrupted. In the dark room, Rael silently waited for her mother to return. When her mother arrived, Rael warned her with a very determined tone, threatening that if she continued to sabotage her, then she would not let it go. Her mother was petrified by Rael's gaze and could hardly believe that this woman had truly become a demon. Shifting to the scene this side when So-ra's father called her, she was so terrified that her hands shook uncontrollably and she immediately hung up. When her father's subordinate called, she was still trembling with fear to the extent that barely able to breathe. It turned out that Guillaume had secretly opened a private company without her father-in-law's knowledge, which clearly indicated an intention to steal market share from the wealthiest father-in-law in South Korea. So-ra's father enragedly drove off in pursuit of her, scaring her so much that she didn't dare open the door and tried to flee. Realizing that the situation was unavoidable, So-ra reluctantly went to meet her father. Indeed, as soon as they met, that her father grabbed her by the hair and threw her to the ground and scolded her for not even being able to control her own husband. He even threatened to lock her in the secret chamber. So-ra immediately recalled how, when she was a child, she had witnessed her mother being beaten to death by her father in that very chamber. Haunted by that memory, she understood that there was a real possibility her father might kill her, so she hastily knelt down and begged for mercy. Luckily, her father's subordinate also pleaded on her behalf, so she was spared, and Rael had witnessed the entire scene through the surveillance room. The conflict between the father and daughter was yet another unexpected turn outside of Rael's plan. After enduring multiple onslaughts, So-Ra looked at her husband, who's sleeping next to her. That murderous thoughts began to surface. It was because of this man that she had suffered so much. She suddenly remembered how, at the kindergarten, her husband had looked at Rael with regret in his eyes, and her rage flared up. So-Ra pressed a knife against Guillaume's neck, but in the end, she couldn't go through with it. She loved this man too deeply. With no outlet for her frustration, the next day, So-Ra went to confront Rael. She even called 2 other parents from the kindergarten and told them that Rael had deliberately swapped the children's backpacks, causing conflict between them in an effort to isolate Rael from everyone. Moreover, she demanded the headmaster expel Rael's child from school. So-Ra intended to use this to take revenge on Rael, but was shocked when Rael, instead of being bothered, that she burst out into a terrifying laugh. Even she went on to say that the next person to be expelled would be So-Ra. After saying this, she intentionally turned on some music and started dancing. When So-Ra heard the familiar tune, she immediately thought of how her husband would play this song when they were intimate. So she angrily stormed over to Rael and asked if she had gone mad. But instead of responding, Rael burst into laughter again, then mocking So-Ra for looking so pathetic. So-Ra furiously tried to hit Rael, but Rael quickly countered. So-Ra's bodyguard was about to intervene, but Rael pointed out that there were cameras everywhere, so the bodyguard hesitated. Now So-Ra completely enraged. She had intended to take out her anger on Rael, but unexpectedly, that Rael had turned the tables on her. Left with no choice, So-Ra stormed out with her bodyguard. After calming down, Rael called Guillaume, but just after pressing the call button, she immediately hung up and put the phone down. As expected, within 3 seconds, Guillaume called her back. Rael smirked because this man was completely under her control. The first thing Guillaume said was that he wanted to meet her at a hotel. Rael arrived as promised, and this time she no longer ran from him. Perhaps she had developed feelings for him before, which made her afraid of losing control, so she ran away. But now none of that mattered anymore. Whether he genuinely liked her or it was just out of lust that she no longer cared. Her only goal now was to completely ruin So-Ra's life. During the grand opening of the company, the couple had even specially invited the chairman of the Italian conglomerate to attend. When So-Ra was appointed as the company's representative, the elite audience gave her a round of enthusiastic applause. For So-Ra, who had never been acknowledged since childhood, a sudden sense of success surged in her heart. However, she had no idea that she was falling into Rael's revenge plan. Indeed, the next day, Guillaume asked for a divorce. Although So-Ra begged her husband desperately, Guillaume had already been completely captivated by Rael, and even when she touched him that he felt disgusted. Guillaume packed his bags and intending to leave the house. At this point, So-Ra was on the verge of a complete breakdown. She picked up the knife and slashed through her husband's down jacket, then sat down and cried in despair. Meanwhile, Guillaume had taken Rael to a church, and hand in hand they entered the church in the presence of the divine. He pulled out a pair of rings and slowly slid one onto Rael's finger, then beginning his proposal. He said that he had truly been captivated by the crazed version of herself that resembled him so much. He thanked her for allowing him to be who he was now and for understanding him. He told her that he loved her. After that, Guillaume asked Rael if she dared to swear before the divine that the man standing in front of her was the one she truly loved. Rael immediately found herself once again torn by the struggle of hatred. She recalled how she had once asked her father what to do when faced with inner conflict, and her father had replied that she should simply follow her heart. In this moment, Rael made up her mind and finally voiced the answer in her heart. She agreed to Guillaume's proposal. However, soon after, thoughts of revenge resurfaced in her mind. It was as if an intense battle between an angel and a demon was raging within her soul. All kinds of chaotic sounds eventually caused her to collapse mentally and faint. And just at that moment, her mother happened to walk in and witness the scene. When she saw the wounds Rael had inflicted on herself, her mother remarked that she had always complained about Rael being blinded by love, but hadn't realized how hard Rael had tried to pull herself out of it. She then encouraged her to boldly follow the call of her heart, assuring her that even if she truly loved the enemy, that she wouldn't blame her. However, Rael felt even more conflicted. Meanwhile, So-Ra, determined to exact revenge on Rael, didn't shy away from using any means necessary. She approached the 2 ladies she had danced with earlier and used a video of them getting intimate with 2 male dancers to blackmail them, forcing them to use So-Ra's family-owned media to expose rumors about Rael's chaotic relationships with men. Soon that a series of articles scandals damaging Rael's reputation were broadcasted on TV. After receiving the news, Pyong started to worry for Rael, fearing that if these reports gained traction and Rael became the target of online searches, her true identity would quickly be revealed to Guillaume. On the other hand, Rael remained completely calm. While she and Guillaume were strolling along the beach, he told her that if she didn't want to be bothered anymore, he could take her abroad to live. He said he could give up all his money and status for her. However, Rael just laughed and told him he was being foolish, not acting like a chairman at all. Guillaume then sensed something strange, because a normal woman would want to run away with the person she loved. But Rael was the complete opposite. He realized she must have a secret she couldn't reveal to anyone. Guillaume then figured out the scar on Rael's arm, and the terrifying sight of it broke his heart. He pleaded with Rael to tell him the truth. Without saying this, they couldn't be happy together. In the next scene, Rael's mother sought out Pyong and told him that after Rael's father passed away, despite suffering from severe panic disorder, she had only recently managed to recover. But lately, the condition had suddenly relapsed, because Rael was once again like she had been before, would end up self-harming when she was emotionally distressed, and this issue was definitely related to Guillaume. If she continued to be caught between hatred and love, there was a strong possibility that Rael might end up leaving herself from the world. Upon hearing this, Pyong became alarmed and immediately went to the villa where Rael and Guillaume were staying, then calling her out. As soon as they met, he asked Rael if she had truly fallen in love with her enemy. Rael responded that if it was truly love, then what of it? Pyong was deeply worried for her, then became enraged and scolded her. He recalled how Rael had once planned to leave the world on her own, which made him extremely anxious. He urged Rael to give up her feelings for Guillaume. However, Pyong's harsh words were driven by his deep affection for Rael. After Pyong left, that Rael wandered inside the house like someone lost. At that moment, a person dressed in black appeared before her. It turned out that this person was a bodyguard sent by So-ra, and he was there to take her life. Just as Rael was about to be taken away, that Pyong appeared. He picked up a wooden stick and fought against the attackers, while the bodyguard beside him recalled So-ra's orders. Must certainly kidnap Rael. If he can't catch, then he could kill her. So he immediately pulled out a knife and attacked Rael. At the critical moment, Pyong stepped in front of Rael to protect her. Seeing that he had injured a potential presidential candidate, then the bodyguard became frightened and fled. Upon returning to the villa, So-ra was almost driven to madness upon hearing the news. Despite being the daughter of the wealthiest tycoon in South Korea, if So-ra were to be implicated in the murder of a congressional member, she could very well end up in prison. Therefore, she immediately instructed her bodyguard to find out the extent of Pyong's injuries. Meanwhile, when Guillaume learned that Rael was in danger, he rushed to her side and noticed the blood on her clothes. After confirming that she was not injured, he was able to assured. He then asked her who was responsible for the attack and if she had seen the face of the perpetrator. However, Rael could not think clearly and merely responded that it didn't matter if she saw the face, since his wife would likely send more people to harm her anyway. Guillaume also realized this. If the identity of Rael as the wife is not quickly confirmed, So-ra would undoubtedly continue to cause trouble for her. Therefore, the next day, he took Rael to the company and announced her appointment as the CEO of the group during a meeting. Seeing Rael speak professionally on stage, Guillaume's eyes were filled with pride. Meanwhile, in Hanpan-ro's villa, that news nearly caused him to have a fit. The shock left him breathless. He immediately sent a lawyer to hold a press conference regarding Guillaume's divorce and even demanded that Guillaume compensate him with 10 trillion won. Furthermore, he demanded that Guillaume transfer all shares of the LY Group to him, claiming that Guillaume's personal life had disrupted the company. On the other hand, So-ra remained stubbornly obsessed. Upon seeing the news on TV, she shouted angrily and blamed whoever mentioned the divorce litigation. When she arrived at her father's villa, she loudly declared that she did not want a divorce, which only led to her father waking up and scolding her. He said that since they no longer needed her, she should stop clinging to them, but So-ra stubbornly ignored him and shouted that she only needed to kill Rael. To her surprise, her father slapped her directly. With the entire country of South Korea discussing So-ra and Rael, if Rael were to be targeted now, their past misdeeds would also be exposed. Meanwhile, in the hospital, Pyong finally regained consciousness. After going through this ordeal, he understood that true love was not about possession, but about letting go. He held Rael's hand and comforted her, telling her that if she truly loved Guillaume, she should muster the courage to move forward, and he would no longer stand in her way. At this moment, moment, Rael felt deeply guilty, realizing that her quest for revenge had caused suffering for those who cared about her. Therefore, she decided that she should not love her enemy. She gathered her resolve to start exacting revenge on Sora. The next day, Rael sent people to Guillaume's house to drive Sora out. The former high society lady now found herself in a truly miserable situation, and from now on, Rael was the new mistress of the place. Unable to accept this, Sora went to Guillaume's office, clinging to her last bit of hope, and pleaded with him not to proceed with the divorce. She reminded him to think back on the happy moments they had went through, insisted that his relationship with Rael was just a temporary infatuation that he would soon tire of. However, Guillaume countered that his marriage with Sora had been purely a matter of convenience, and it was only with Rael that he truly felt the essence of love. As Guillaume got up to leave, Sora noticed the ring on his ring finger and realized in that moment that all hope was lost. Back at home, Sora could no longer hold herself together. In the empty room, she could still hear Rael's laughter echoing in her ears. Meanwhile, Rael was breaking into Guillaume's safe, and after some searching, came across a file stained with blood. Seeing her father's signature on the contract, Rael could not hold back her tears and began to cry uncontrollably. Her mind immediately flashed back to the scene where her father was killed by enemies for refusing to surrender the company's shares. As she was completely immersed in this painful memory, Guillaume appeared behind her and asked what she was doing. Rael was startled and frightened, and the atmosphere in the secret room was incredibly tense, with only the pounding of Rael's heart breaking the silence. Without a reasonable explanation, her 13-year plan for revenge could fall apart. Guillaume, seeing the file in her hand that began to harbor suspicions, as he slowly approached Rael, she was fortunately saved by the sudden arrival of Guillaume's daughter. While Guillaume carried his daughter outside, Rael collapsed and breathed a sigh of relief. In the hospital, Pyong was extremely worried upon learning that she had been discovered. Rael responded that Guillaume might not suspect her yet, but she wasn't aware that a greater trouble loomed her, that is at Sora's place. Previously, when she had instructed her bodyguards to investigate Rael, Sora accidentally discovered that Rael and her current mother were not biologically related. Furthermore, when she learned that her mother's name was Moon-hee, Sora suddenly felt that something was strange. Although it was the first time she had heard this name, it felt strangely familiar. Eventually, she remembered that the name Moon-hee belonged to the mother of the girl who had once loved Guillaume and was killed by Sora. Now this woman had become Rael's mother, which implied there was a secret that couldn't be shared with others. Consequently, Sora instructed her bodyguards to sneak into Moon-hee's house that night and abduct her, then taking her to a warehouse. In front of Moon-hee, Sora clearly recounted how she had murdered Moon-hee's daughter years ago. From Moon-hee's reaction, Sora knew her suspicions were correct. She then asked Moon-hee what her relationship with Rael was and what Rael's true identity was. Seeing the enemy before her, Moon-hee spat in Sora's face, but Sora just laughed maniacally. After that, she ordered her bodyguards to torture Moon-hee. On the other hand, since Guillaume discovered Rael entering the secret room, he had begun to suspect her. As a result, he had pulled her aside for a conversation that night. He asked Rael if there was something wrong and insisting that she be honest with him. However, Rael stubbornly maintained that there was nothing amiss. Guillaume then said that although he was madly in love with her, he was not a fool, and she should not make him uncover any hidden secrets. The next day, Sora, that full of energy, stood in front of the mirror trying on clothes, a stark contrast to her distraught appearance the night before. She then went to Rael and Guillaume's villa. Seeing Rael playing the role of a wife, Sora sneered at her and then mentioned the name Lee Rael. Instantly, the smile faded from Rael's face. Sora knew that this name indicated she was aware of Rael's true identity. Observing Rael's panic-stricken reaction, Sora felt even more satisfied. She then went to find Guillaume, claiming she had something important to discuss with him. However, Guillaume, that having grown utterly weary of Sora, so he rebuked her for her shamelessness. Before being scolded, Sora took the opportunity to leave, but she sneered and told Guillaume that he would soon have to thank her. She then called Rael to sit down and talk. Under Rael's terrified gaze, Sora threw the documents and childhood photos of Rael in front of Guillaume. Rael was extremely anxious, but to her surprise, Guillaume loved Rael so much that despite the clear evidence, he still instructed his subordinates to expel Sora. Nevertheless, Sora was very confident. Before leaving, she told her husband that if he reviewed all the documents on the table, he would undoubtedly decide not to proceed with a divorce. Afterward, Rael and Guillaume went out to dinner together. Although Guillaume did not ask any questions, the quiet atmosphere made Rael extremely nervous. Consequently, she took the initiative to cover up everything. She explained that her father's death and her mother's remarriage forced her to change her name. Guillaume then asked Rael if that was all she wanted to explain. At that moment, moment, she suddenly became clear-headed. If she couldn't look Guillaume directly in the eye at that moment, her 13-year revenge plan would be in jeopardy. So she confronted Guillaume and asked if he was suspicious of her. As expected, Guillaume then picked up the documents on the table and tore them to shreds. He told Rael that he wouldn't press her on what she didn't want to reveal and that he didn't care about her past. He said they were just beginning, and then he left the restaurant. It wasn't until Guillaume got into his car that Rael let out a sigh of relief. She immediately sent a message to her bodyguard, instructing him to discreetly remove the documents from the table. When returning home, Rael quietly reassembled the documents that night. It turned out So-ra knew about their impending lawsuit and was aware of Rael's mother's true identity. Rael then realized that her mother might be in danger. Therefore, she called Pyong to report the situation, unaware that Guillaume was secretly watching her from behind the window. The next day, Rael rushed to her mother's house, only to find the room in chaos with no one in sight. Moreover, the phone had also been turned off. At this point, Rael was certain that So-ra was behind this, so she immediately went to the hospital to report the situation to Pyong. When he learned of the situation, he was afraid that Rael might also be in danger, so he decided to leave the hospital despite his wounds still not being fully healed. On her way to find So-ra, Rael was followed by Guillaume. Fortunately, Pyong managed to detect this and called Guillaume to divert his attention. When the two met, Pyong subtly hinted to Guillaume that his father-in-law's family would face punishment, and if he did not want to be implicated, he should quickly proceed with the divorce. Just as Pyong was leaving, Guillaume asked him if he had feelings for Rael. Pyong told Guillaume that although Rael was with him now, she would eventually leave him. Guillaume responded that his love for Rael was immense. Hearing this, Pyong rebutted and said that Guillaume only suspected Rael, but did not truly sacrifice for her. Meanwhile, Rael had also found So-ra. Upon meeting, she demanded that So-ra release her mother, but untimely, So-ra was not interested in negotiating with her. So-ra just mocked her, asking if she had been kicked out by Guillaume. As a result, Rael's next statement made it impossible for So-ra to keep laughing. Rael asked what So-ra would do if Guillaume found out that So-ra had sent her bodyguards to harm her. So-ra immediately became anxious. If Guillaume learned of her wrongdoing, then she would lose. Just as So-ra was still reeling from the shock, Rael continued stating that before midnight tonight, So-ra must return her mother safely. After that, Rael would leave Guillaume and return the house to So-ra. After returning home, Rael quickly moved out. Knowing that Guillaume was suspicious of her, she needed to resolve the matter quickly and immediately filed a lawsuit. However, before leaving, she had one more important task. That is the contract that her enemy had forced her father to hand over, which was kept in Guillaume's safe. She skillfully attempted to open the safe, but discovered that she had entered the wrong code. At this moment, she was unaware that every move she made was being monitored by Guillaume through surveillance cameras. Meanwhile, Guillaume's mind was filled with thoughts of his wife discussing Rael's true identity. However, Guillaume then picked up the phone and gave Rael the password. He also provided a reason, telling her that he needed her to bring a box to him. At this point, Guillaume loved Rael so much that even when she did something wrong against him, then he still chose to trust her unconditionally. Meanwhile, after Rael entered the safe room, she immediately placed the contract that forced upon her father hand over the company by the enemy into her bag. She then called Pyong to inform him that the crucial evidence was in her possession and that she would leave Guillaume that night. So-ra, on the other hand, stormed into Guillaume's office, then frantically demanding to know why he remained resolute about the divorce. It turned out that after delivering the evidence of Rael's true identity to Guillaume the previous day, So-ra was so confident that he would not divorce her that she bought a pile of gifts to reconcile with her father-in-law. However, she was insulted by Guillaume's family, and her brother-in-law even called Guillaume to confirm. On the phone, Guillaume clearly stated that he remained determined to divorce. Hearing this, So-ra was completely devastated, so she ran to confront Guillaume, then questioning if he had gone insane. Clearly knowing that Rael had no good intentions, but why did he still refuse to come to his senses? As a result, he asked her in return if she understood what true love was. He said that he would sacrifice everything for Rael. Hearing this, So-ra was completely devastated. Perhaps this woman truly did not understand what love meant. Her desire to be with Guillaume was merely a matter of possessiveness. After that, Guillaume left So-ra alone and distraught, then he exited the office. Meanwhile, Pyong was at Han Pan-ro's house, pretending to discuss a partnership with him. When he learned that the Alliance of 31 Victims was preparing to file a lawsuit against him from his subordinates, Han Pan-ro immediately panicked. When he asked Pyong if he knew who these people were, then Pyong feigned ignorance, although he was actually the one behind the group. After Pyong left, Han Pan-ro immediately sent his bodyguards to find a woman named Moon Hee. The bodyguards, after hearing this, were worried because the woman was currently being held captive by So-ra in an abandoned warehouse. Han Pan-ro quickly noticed something odd in the bodyguards' expression. expressions and began to question them. At this moment, So-ra also received a phone call from Rael. Rael reminded her once again that if she did not return her mother by midnight, So-ra's and the bodyguard's wrongdoings would be exposed. Consequently, So-ra immediately rushed to the old abandoned warehouse to release Moon-hee, but she discovered that no one was there. Clearly that the bodyguards had already handed Moon-hee over to Han Pan-ro. Meanwhile, when Rael was about to leave with the contract, but she was stopped by Guillaume's bodyguards, who said that Guillaume wanted to see her. She was then taken to a villa where Guillaume was waiting for her. It turned out that Guillaume had specially purchased this villa for Rael, planning to live there with her in the future. Guillaume presented a share transfer agreement for the company, revealing that he was willing to give up everything for Rael. He told her that he didn't know what secrets she was hiding from him, but he would give her everything he had as long as she would stay by his side. At this moment, Rael was deeply moved and tears streamed down her face. How could this man's feelings be so deep while she had intentionally schemed against him behind his back? Guillaume gently wiped her tears and comforted her. The next day, after providing the evidence for the lawsuit to Pyong, Rael also planned to confess everything to Guillaume before causing any more harm to him. This was the minimum courtesy in love. Therefore, she arranged to meet Guillaume at a bar. However, right after making the call, she heard her mother's cry for help. Unable to wait for Guillaume any longer, that she immediately rushed back home. When Guillaume arrived at the bar and couldn't find Rael, he decided to go to her house. On the way back, he saw a notification about a class action lawsuit on his phone. He then received a call from his father, who informed him that the corporation was being sued by a woman named Moon-hee and the daughter of the semiconductor company. Upon hearing the name Moon-hee, Guillaume was shocked. Wasn't this woman Rael's mother? In other words, could Rael be the daughter of that semiconductor company? Guillaume couldn't bear to think further and immediately went back to the safe in his house. However, even after rummaging through the place, he couldn't find the acquisition contract for the semiconductor company. Guillaume immediately recalled the documents Rael had held earlier while pretending to play hide and seek with the children. He angrily knocked all the books off the shelf and then drove to Rael's house to find her. Meanwhile, Rael, that having just returned from the bar, immediately checked the location of her mother through the surveillance system at home and discovered that she was at Han Pan-ro's house. She then called Pyong for help. Upon hearing this, Pyong promptly contacted the prosecution team that night and set out for Han Pan-ro's house to rescue her. At that moment, Guillaume had also seen Rael's car outside. He touched the hood and found it still warm, indicating that Rael had just returned. Just as Rael was trying to call her mother in the secret room, she suddenly heard the sound of a door breaking. However, the surveillance screen showed no one outside. Suspecting something, Rael went out to check. Through the long, secret tunnel, Rael descended to the living room on the ground floor, but unaware that as soon as she left, that Guillaume had emerged from the back door and entered the secret room. The moment he stepped inside, he was stunned to see the surveillance equipment installed all over the room. The computer screen even displayed his call list. But what shocked him even more was yet to come. When Guillaume turned to look at the photos on the wall, he was completely shaken. At that moment, he finally understood why Rael had gone to such lengths to get close to him. It was to destroy him. Guillaume's mind raced back to all the things Rael had done in the beginning to win his trust. Just as he started to doubt everyone around him that Rael returned home, Guillaume furiously yelled directly in her face, asking her how she could treat him like this. Seeing that Guillaume was about to lose control, Rael was terrified and tried to run out of the room, but he grabbed her. Guillaume frantically questioned Rael, asking if she was trying to ruin his life. As Rael attempted to escape again, then Guillaume threw her against the bookshelf. Seeing her in pain curling up on the floor, Guillaume immediately regained some composure and began to regret his violent outburst toward her. Therefore, he quickly apologized and tried to help Rael up, but at that moment, Rael was so terrified that she pushed him away. Seeing the wall filled with revenge plans and Rael avoiding him, Guillaume had never felt such an overwhelming sense of failure in his life as he did today. Unable to bear it any longer, he broke down and cried uncontrollably. Meanwhile, the woman standing on the verge of death was being interrogated by the South Korean Prime Minister. Despite being tortured to the point of unconsciousness, but she refused to drop the lawsuit against him. Han Pan-ro not only killed her daughter, but also stole her company. Now she had evidence of Han Pan-ro's crimes in her hands, but at the last moment, she was captured and taken to a secret room in a mansion. Seeing that the woman was determined not to speak, Han Pan-ro left to rest. After they departed his daughter, So-ra entered the secret room and woke Moon-hee to take her away. So-ra wanted to use this woman to win back her husband's heart. However, to her surprise, the woman only laughed mockingly. Moon-hee said that So-ra's husband would never return to her. At this point, So-ra, that blinded by love, didn't even bother to think it over anymore. She immediately instructed the bodyguard to take take the woman out of the secret room. However, they ran into her father, who was returning to continue the interrogation, and he angrily scolded So-ra. If Moon-hee succeeded in filing the lawsuit, Han Pan-ro would spend the rest of his life in prison. But So-ra, still unaware of the situation, so she still burst into tears and saying that she didn't want a divorce. While the father and daughter were arguing, Moon-hee seized the opportunity to try and escape but was quickly dragged back by Han Pan-ro's men. At this point, Han Pan-ro furiously picked up a stone and struck Moon-hee. Blood immediately gushed out, causing So-ra to scream in terror. A bodyguard rushed over to check Moon-hee's carotid artery and then shook his head. Just as everyone was panicking, the sound of police sirens suddenly blared outside. It turned out that Pyong had tracked down the location using the device on Moon-hee. After receiving the alert, Han Pan-ro quickly instructed So-ra and the bodyguard to take the body back to the basement. They then cleaned up the blood at the scene. When Pyong brought the police into the villa, Han Pan-ro immediately put on an expression as if he had been disturbed while sleeping. When Pyong asked him to hand over Moon-hee, Han Pan-ro feigned innocence and pretended as he knew nothing. However, Pyong didn't bother listening to him and immediately instructed the police to begin searching. At that moment, So-ra, who was hiding in the secret room, broke into a cold sweat upon hearing the search above. But in the end, nothing dangerous happened, as Pyong did not discover Moon-hee's whereabouts. He was helpless and had no choice but to leave. After returning home, he told Rael that he couldn't find her mother. Hearing this, Rael collapsed onto the sofa and unable to hold herself up anymore. Pyong comforted her, saying the police would continue searching and that everything would be fine. Rael then told him about Guillaume discovering her at the secret base. Hearing this, Pyong grew deeply concerned and immediately asked if Guillaume had hurt her. Rael shook her head. Right now, she only hoped to quickly finish her revenge. Perhaps she did have feelings for Guillaume, but those emotions could only remain buried deep in her heart. Meanwhile, Han Pan-ro was almost discovered, which infuriated him to the point of brutally beating So-ra. Shortly after that, a subordinate came in to report that they had disposed of Moon-hee's body, but Han Pan-ro, still enraged, so he locked So-ra in the secret room, despite her kneeling and begging for forgiveness. The subordinate threw the body into the river, but the next day, a fisherman discovered it. Rael saw her mother lying in the morgue, and the pain drove her to the brink of despair and igniting a burning rage within her. She swore to avenge Han Pan-ro. At the funeral home, when Rael was contemplating how to gather evidence proving her mother was murdered, the staff handed her her mother's belongings. Rael grievingly opened the box and began sorting through the items when she accidentally touched something in her mother's pocket. Upon pulling it out, she was shocked to find it was a voice recorder. When she returned to the secret base, Rael immediately played the recording. As soon as the recording started, the brutal sounds of her mother being tortured to death seemed to play vividly in Rael's mind. Rael paused the recording, the overwhelming pain making it impossible for her to breathe. However, Pyong pressed play again, and to their shock, that the next part of the recording mentioned the murder of Rael's biological mother. Many years ago, her mother had also been thrown into the river by Han Pan-ro's subordinates, and the real culprit behind her death was So-ra. At this moment, Rael was filled with so much hatred she could barely breathe. Meanwhile, So-ra, as if sensing Rael's intense hatred, sat curled up in fear in the corner of the secret room. But then, Moon-hee, who was supposed to be dead, appeared in the room and seemingly seeking revenge. So-ra, terrified and screamed loudly, and soon saw Rael standing outside the door. But all of this was just an illusion of So-ra's mind. She frantically pounded on the iron door and begged to be let out. And the next day, the bodyguard indeed came to release her. When So-ra saw the ambulance, she seemed to glimpse her last bit of hope and rushed madly toward it, crying and screaming at the driver to drive away quickly. Meanwhile, Guillaume also learned about Moon-hee's death, prompting him to head to the funeral site. At this moment, Rael stood before the funeral altar and dressed in a black mourning outfit. After placing a white flower down, Guillaume tried to comfort Rael, telling her not to be too sad. However, unexpectedly, that Rael ignored his words and said that they should wait to rot in hell. Guillaume hastily asked who she was referring to, and she responded with 3 names: Han Pan-ro, So-ra, and Guillaume. Guillaume was immediately stunned and quickly tried to explain that he had no involvement in Moon-hee's murder. But Rael gave him no chance to explain, and instead played the recording of Moon-hee while she was still alive, then directly kicked him out. After stepping outside, nearly fainted on the spot. He recalled how he had accused his wife of murder 5 years ago, but at that time, he hadn't known the victim was Rael's biological mother, and he'd even helped his wife cover up the crime. Now, he deeply resented his wife for dragging him into this mess. After returning home, he found his wife there. Guillaume angrily told his wife to get out. He didn't want to be with the murderer for even a second, but So-ra knelt knelt down and begged him for forgiveness. She said that she didn't expect to win his love back, but at the very least she begged him not to throw her out. If she were to leave, her father would beat her to death. In the end, Guillaume's heart softened, and he allowed her to stay. Meanwhile, Rael had also posted online that she would be filing a lawsuit against the Prime Minister of South Korea the next day. In an instant, the entire media world was in an uproar, with everyone discussing how a country's politician could commit murder. At that moment, Han Pan-ro was angrily criticizing his bodyguard for letting So-ra out. When he learned that the daughter of the semiconductor company from years ago was personally planning to file the lawsuit, Han Pan-ro became immediately fearful. He realized that his second half of life would likely be spent in prison. The scene then shifted to Rael at the press conference, where she exposed the numerous crimes of Han Pan-ro. At the same time, Han Pan-ro's subordinate, Jung Chul, arrived at the scene to stop Rael, but faced with such a large crowd of reporters, basically, he couldn't take any action. As Rael stepped onto the stage, that she spotted the man who had murdered her father. And as their eyes met, Jung Chul immediately recalled the scene from years ago, when he had given Rael a sinister smile in the hospital after murdering her father. Just moments ago, Rael had returned the same kind of smile to him. After the incident concluded, Rael left the conference room and accidentally saw Jung Chul reporting to Han Pan-ro. Fueled by intense hatred, she quickly got into her car and honked the horn to interrupt Jung Chul's conversation. Seeing Rael in the car, Jung Chul began to curse and sought to confront her. However, unexpectedly that Rael accelerated and drove straight toward him. Terrified by the approaching car, Jung Chul jumped aside, but Rael had no intention of letting him off the hook. She reversed the car and ran over his leg, causing him to scream in pain. Rael then got out of the car and, seeing Jung Chul writhing on the ground, was reminded of the time he had kicked her father in the neck. She then stomped hard on his broken leg. At that moment, Rael's husband returned from the US, and after he called her as his wife, Rael immediately told him not to call her so disgustingly and wait for the punishment as the price to pay for betraying the semiconductor company that year. After saying that words, she coldly left there. Meanwhile, as the president's secretary, Pyong also organized a press conference. He specifically mentioned that he had been injured by So-ra's bodyguards on that day and publicly exposed a series of crimes committed by Han Pan-ro and his associates. This led to chaos at the scene. At this moment, Guillaume sat alone in his room, witnessing how the situation had escalated to this point. Unsure of what might happen if Rael's lawsuit was not stopped, he approached her with the last bit of hope and asked for her forgiveness. However, Rael told him that only his death could erase the hatred in her heart. After venting her anger, Rael left the room and leaned against the railing, then gasping for breath. Despite having exploited Guillaume for a long time, she could still feel the genuine love he had for her. As Guillaume went downstairs, he unexpectedly encountered So-ra, who had come looking for him. When So-ra learned that her husband had come to confess his wrongdoing, So-ra, still blind to the situation, told Guillaume to stay positive and questioned why he should lower himself to Rael. Seeing his foolish wife, Guillaume could only shake his head in despair. Meanwhile, Rael, that being upstairs, had also spotted So-ra and immediately thought of her mother, who had been killed by So-ra, as revealed in the recording. Without heeding Pyong's attempts to stop her, Rael smashed a vase, picked up a sharp shard, and headed downstairs with the intent to kill So-ra. As she descended, she overheard Guillaume's words. He expressed that his only wish was to be a good person in Rael's eyes. At that moment, Rael's resolve wavered, and she slowly loosened her grip on the shard. Pyong was heartbroken, then took the shard from Rael's hand, gently cleaned the blood, and advised Rael not to listen, stressing that she could not afford to be weak at such a crucial moment. Despite everything, Rael still deeply loved Guillaume. The next day, Rael officially filed a lawsuit for the murder of her father, but to her surprise, Guillaume appeared in court personally. Rael suspected that Guillaume's presence was an attempt to use public pressure to delay the verdict. However, unexpectedly, that Guillaume ignored Rael's incomplete evidence and proactively requested an out-of-court settlement with her. The lawyer sitting beside him quickly intervened, warning that if he agreed to the settlement, there would be no opportunity to refute the charges, effectively meaning an admission of guilt. This action left everyone present astonished. Seeing Guillaume's current efforts to help her, the hatred in Rael's heart, which had been encased in layers of ice, began to melt under his warmth. Meanwhile, So-ra, after seeing news about Guillaume and Rael in court on TV, began to feel jealous due to her husband's betrayal. Her secretary reminded her that the more pressing issue was the accusation of murder against her. So-ra was overwhelmed by a series of attacks that could no longer withstand the pressure. Once a renowned wealthy woman, but she was now alone, carving designs into her toothbrush's mirror with a knife throughout the long night. The next day, Rael and Guillaume met at the courthouse to settle the matter. The judge reminded Guillaume that Han Pan-ro, Jong-chul, and So-ra had not agreed to the settlement, and as a result, all crucial evidence in the murder case Rael had filed was gathered illegally and could not be presented in court. If Guillaume agreed to the amicable settlement, it would mean an admission of guilt, but he remained resolute and unhesitatingly wanted to settle the matter. During the conversation with the judge, Rael admitted that although fabricating her identity and secretly installing listening devices were illegal, she had no other choice since her parents had passed away when she was just 15. Rael looked at Guillaume, but unsure of how to express her feelings to him. What she truly felt was love for Guillaume, yet she did not communicate this to him. Despite her deep love for him, she was afraid to admit it, fearing that revealing her feelings would make her vulnerable. Rael knew that the illegal evidence she had collected would be ineffective in court, so Pyong suggested deliberately sowing discord to make them destroy each other, starting with dealing with Guillaume first. After Guillaume and Rael reached a settlement, he proactively requested that Rael be taken to retrieve her mother's belongings. However, upon arriving at the scene, she found that the staff made excuses to withhold them, claiming that the items had been taken by the prosecutors. Upon hearing this, Rael realized that someone must have intentionally blocked her access. Meanwhile, after Pyong learned the news, he immediately went to the scene. Faced with the chief secretary, the department head put on a displeased expression. It was then that she confessed that Han Pan-ro had used his position as prime minister to pressure them. Upon hearing this, Pyong was infuriated. If they were not going to adhere to the principles but rather use their authority, then he would have to use his position as chief secretary to address the issue. Meanwhile, while waiting, Rael happened to notice that Guillaume was still wearing the ring he had proposed to her with. She asked him why he hadn't taken it off, but Guillaume replied that he had no chance to remove it. He said he wore it because he loved her and could only take it off when he no longer loved her. Even if they hated each other, it did not mean that he no longer loved her. Guillaume then asked Rael if she had never felt a moment of genuine love for him when they danced the tango and their hearts were close. Rael coldly responded that she had approached him only for revenge and that their purposes were different. As their conversation ended in silence, then under the pressure from Pyong, the staff brought out Rael's mother's belongings. When Rael opened the box, she caressed the photographs of her happy family, and at that moment, the torment of hatred surged up in her mind again, causing her to cry uncontrollably. Seeing this, Guillaume could only lower his head, feeling deeply remorseful. Rael then opened her mother's diary, and it was then that she learned her mother had pretended to be missing to protect her. After Rael went abroad, her mother had protested daily in front of Guillaume's company with a placard, but Guillaume had ignored her many times as he did not know the truth behind her actions. In the diary, Rael's mother urged her to let go of her hatred and continue living well. Rael also found a video of her mother when she was still alive. In the video, it was shown that So-ra had taken over Rael's father's company and used it as a dowry to marry Guillaume. After watching the video, Guillaume suddenly realized that he had been nothing more than a tool in the marriage between his father and Han Pan-ro. The LY group, which he had acquired through his marriage to So-ra, had been obtained as a result of Rael's father's murder. Guillaume cried and apologized to Rael, but she had fallen into a state of madness and grabbed his collar and telling him to die. Guillaume said he would do anything she wanted. The next day, to atone for his sins, Guillaume held a press conference where he confessed to all charges, including the appropriation of Rael's father's company and murder. Upon seeing the news, Han Pan-ro went into a rage and rushed to the company to find Guillaume, but was stopped by the security guards at the door. Meanwhile, Jong-chul, who had been injured and hospitalized by Rael, could no longer remain calm and immediately called Han Pan-ro. As a result, Han Pan-ro was angry and hung up the phone directly. At this point, Jong-chul had developed a strong dislike for Han Pan-ro. Meanwhile, So-ra, who was going crazy at home, was informed by her secretary that the police were outside and wanted to arrest her. Furthermore, someone had submitted the recording of her killing Moon-hee to the court. So-ra enragedly asked her secretary who had done this. Rael then called to inform her that Han Pan-ro had agreed Rael's request for conciliation and that So-ra would be held responsible for all the charges. She also revealed that the recording had been given to her by Han Pan-ro. After hearing this, So-ra could hardly believe her ears and immediately called her bodyguard to ask about it. The bodyguard confirmed that it was indeed Han Pan-ro who had done it. After hanging up, So-ra was devastated, but she was unaware that the bodyguard had been incited by Rel and Pyong. The bodyguard then went to Han Pan-ro's mansion to inform him that So-ra had handed over the incriminating photo to the court. Han Pan-ro furiously grabbed a hammer and planned to go kill So-ra. At that moment, So-ra arrived at her father's place to confront him, and they both began to fight upon seeing each other. Just as Han Pan-ro was about to strike So-ra with the hammer, the bodyguard attacked from behind and knocking Han Pan-ro unconscious. Subsequently, So-ra imprisoned her father in a secret chamber where he desperately pleaded with her to let him out. He never even imagined that he would one day be locked in the secret chamber he used for secretly committing murder. After returning to the mansion, So-ra dismissed all the household staff, including the bodyguard she had once cherished. She then began to plan her revenge against Rael. Meanwhile, ever since Guillaume held the press conference, he had turned off his phone and disappeared under mysterious circumstances. After a thorough search, the secretary discovered a will on Guillaume's computer and quickly went to find Pyong and Rael. Upon hearing this, Rael could hardly believe her eyes. In the will, Guillaume stated that he was resigning as chairman and would leave forever to atone for the harm he had caused to others. This immediately reminded Rael of the time she had angrily told Guillaume to go DI, but in front of Pyong, she maintained a composed facade. However, a dream in the middle of the night revealed to her how deeply she cared about Guillaume's fate. Upon waking from the nightmare, she found her hands drenched in cold sweat. At that moment, Guillaume's secretary called to inform her that before disappearing, Guillaume had transferred all his shares to Rael. Guillaume left only his personal assets to his daughter. After hanging up the phone, Rael could no longer stay calm. She began to worry that Guillaume might really leave this world on his own. Therefore, she immediately drove out that night to find Guillaume. Eventually, she located him at the church where he had previously proposed to her. Upon seeing Guillaume safe and sound, Rael could no longer deceive herself and completely dropped her disguise. She admitted that she was truly terrified something might happen to him. Seeing the pained expression on Rael's face, Guillaume felt a surge of emotions and immediately pulled her into a tight embrace. Meanwhile, with her resolve for revenge, So-ra applied a new layer of makeup with a dark tone. Later, the secretary called to report that they had tracked Guillaume and Rael to the seaside villa. After ending the call, So-ra took out a black box, then she opened it and found a gun inside. As So-ra contemplated shooting Rael, Jung-chul with one leg injured that came to find Han Pan-ro. At this point, So-ra had fully intended to leave her father to die in the secret chamber. She directly lied that her father had run away with the money and only leaving behind 2 gold bars. She then persuaded Jung-chul to join her in killing Rael. Jung-chul, who was also infuriated, agreed and drove with So-ra to Guillaume's villa. Meanwhile, in the villa, Rael had completely let her guard down, and Guillaume was also very happy. The two were enjoying their time together in the room and oblivious to the imminent danger. Pyong, that having learned that So-ra was going to find Rael, realized the danger and drove to Rael's location that night. At that moment, Jung-chul and So-ra were speeding towards the villa in a frenzy. Rael had fallen asleep in Guillaume's arms, but the previous nightmare returned, causing her to wake up with a start. The dream of Guillaume's death seemed like a forewarning of what was to come. Guillaume worried and gently comforted Rael, telling her that it was just a dream. Rael anxiously held Guillaume's hand tightly and urged him not to consider leaving this world. He then asked her what her wish was, and Rael said she wanted to live happily with him. Guillaume wanted to live a simple life with her. Such simple wishes, however, seemed extravagant for two people who had been toyed with by fate. At this moment, Jung-chul had arrived outside the villa. He stuffed a bunch of painkillers into his mouth and swore that he would tear apart the woman who had turned him into a cripple. He then grabbed a hammer and headed towards the villa. Seeing Rael and Guillaume inside the room, he immediately called So-ra and told her to lure Guillaume away. She quickly understood and arranged for her subordinates to use her daughter's phone to call Guillaume and then hang up. So-ra then used her acting skills to deceive Guillaume into believing that their daughter was missing. Upon hearing this, Guillaume was very worried and rushed out of the villa into the rain. However, when he looked back, he saw that the lights in the villa had suddenly gone out. Guillaume immediately realized that this was his wife's plan and rushed back to the villa. By this time, Jung-chul had already broken into the villa. Seeing the hammer in his hand, Rael could only keep retreating. After narrowly avoiding 2 attacks, Rael picked up a decorative item from the table and struck Jung-chul's injured leg forcefully. She then took a hammer and hit his leg again. However, Jung-chul unexpectedly struck her down with a lamp. He then gripped Rael's throat tightly, causing her to struggle desperately. Just as she was in danger danger that Guillaume returned. Seeing Rael injured, he lost all reason and rushed to strangle Zhang Chul. Despite Zhang Chul's painful pleas, Guillaume's eyes were filled with rage. When Rael managed to intervene and stop Guillaume, she discovered that Zhang Chul was already dead. Guillaume looked at his bloodied hands and realized that he had caused a disaster. Meanwhile, Sora was waiting outside the villa for news of victory that grew increasingly anxious when Zhang Chul failed to appear and her calls went unanswered. On the other side, after calming down, Guillaume advised Rael to live well from now on and stated that he would surrender himself. He insisted that this matter had nothing to do with her. Rael immediately disagreed upon hearing this. As she was preparing to go to the police station with Guillaume, Rael suddenly felt dizzy and collapsed into his arms. It turned out that Guillaume had prepared to take responsibility alone, so he had slipped a sleeping pill into her drink before their conversation. By early the next morning, Pyong finally arrived. After Guillaume explained what had happened, Pyong suggested that he could use his position as a counselor to frame the case as self-defense. While Guillaume and Pyong went out to deal with the body, Sora took the opportunity to kidnap Rael. When they returned to the villa, it was too late. After checking the surveillance cameras, Guillaume immediately drove off in pursuit. On the coastal highway, Guillaume and his wife put on a dangerously high-speed performance. At this point, Sora had completely lost her mind and, disregarding her husband's warnings, accelerated to over 300 kilometers per hour. Amid the violent shaking of the car, Rael finally regained consciousness. She quietly untied the rope from her hands and then grabbed Sora's neck from behind, causing Sora to gasp for air as she was strangled. The steering wheel began to lose control, and after swerving from side to side, the car crashed violently into the curb and came to a stop. Inside the car, Sora, who regaining consciousness first, immediately stabbed Rael in the stomach with a knife, causing blood to pour out. However, Rael laughed maniacally and saying that no matter what Sora did, she would never win Guillaume's heart. At this point, Sora was completely deranged. Just as she was about to stab Rael again, Guillaume and Pyong finally arrived. Guillaume quickly subdued his deranged wife, while Pyong carried Rael out of the car. Guillaume then locked the car door, ignoring Sora's screams to let her out, and simply said, "I'm sorry." Sora, hearing this, was stunned, and a sense of foreboding immediately filled her mind. Guillaume looked at Rael outside the car with a look of desperation, recalling the wish she had once expressed. At this moment, he was determined that if he and his wife did not Rael's wish would never come true. With that resolve, he started the car and drove forward. Rael also realized Guillaume's intention. Ignoring her own injury, that she stood up to chase after him and screamed for him to stop, but her cries could not make Guillaume turn back. Until the moment of his deed, he continued to caress the ring he had used to propose to Rael, believing that this might be the only way to fully atone for his mistakes with her. Meanwhile, seeing the love of her life die, Rael screamed in madness, then eventually losing consciousness. The scene shifted to Rael in a hospital. While unconscious, she had a dream where she found herself in a buckwheat field, smelling the faint fragrance of flowers and listening to the cheerful chirping of birds. This was completely different from the violent nightmares she had experienced before, symbolizing that Rael had finally let go of the hatred in her heart. When Pyong woke her up, she learned that she had been asleep for 4 days. Rael immediately inquired about Guillaume's condition. Upon hearing from Pyong that Guillaume had been cremated, Rael was devastated. Meanwhile, Guillaume's father had finally shown a bit of conscience. He held up a photo of his son, then continuously crying and apologizing for failing to fulfill his responsibilities as a father. However, he was surprised when his eldest son reacted differently and attacked Guillaume, furious that Guillaume had left all his company shares to Rael before dying. The eldest son, enragedly and vomiting blood, then screamed in madness. The result was being slapped and beaten by his father. A few days later, Rael and Pum visited the hospital to see Sora. Rael wondered why the good people always seemed to die young, while the bad ones like Sora remained alive. At this point, Sora had become mentally ill, clutching an empty blanket and muttering constantly. The doctor informed Rael that Sora was suffering from schizophrenia and selective amnesia, forgetting the painful memories as a defense mechanism. If she were to recall those memories, the pain would be so intense that it could drive her to leave this world by herself. After the doctor left, Rael slowly entered the hospital room. Sora no longer recognized Rael, but Rael had no intention of forgiving her. She picked up a mirror and placed it in front of Sora. Sora was horrified when she saw her disfigured face. Seeing Sora's devastated state, Rael felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Rael then revealed all the things Sora had done, and only when Sora began to recall those memories did Rael feel at ease to leave. Meanwhile, in the secret chamber of the villa, Han Pan-ro, who imprisoned by his own daughter, had left this world because of starvation. The police discovered his body more than a month later. He died with his eyes wide open, and before his death, he had scratched a deep mark on the ground. Out of the 4 defendants, 3 had left this world, and the only one still alive was Sora, who could not appear in court due to her mental illness. Consequently, only the bodyguard who had always helped them with the murders was left to face the court. Realizing his own guilt, he cried and confessed all the crimes of the Han Pan-ro family. At this moment, the revenge lawsuit that had lasted 13 years finally came to an end. Rael was finally able to let go of her hatred. The film concludes here. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.